And now we move on to the next section, which is learned behaviour. So this differs from the innate behaviour. Innate behaviour, obviously, as we've already been through, is inbuilt, and it's very, very highly stereotyped within species. So each individual member of a species should exhibit the same innate behaviour. Learned behaviour is a different kettle of fish. So in learned behaviour, what we are talking about is an individual's experiences and how they influence its subsequent behaviour. So it could be that they develop an entirely new behaviour, or it could be that they actually modify, so change an existing innate behaviour. And it's really important because what it allows or enables individuals within a species to do is to successfully adapt to their surroundings. So if they find themselves in a different context, so things around them are very different, being able to adapt your responses and learn is incredibly important, because if you were to sort of stay static and always have the same response and the things around you change, it might be that your original response, your original behaviour is now maladaptive. It's now bad for your survival. It leads to your death or lack of success. So learned behaviour, things you need to know about them then, it's dependent upon experiences, obviously. And you know this just as people. You all have different experiences, a bit like nature versus nurture. Depending on your experiences, that changes who you are, how you think, how you respond to things. And it's very similar in all organisms. So it depends on what they're going through and what they experience. What we know is that it's very dependent upon and closely related to things like memory. So we tend to get learned behaviour in higher functioning or organisms that have more complex nervous systems, because in essence you have to have an awful lot of new neuronal pathways developed. In some cases you need to be able to link in very strongly your memories, because you actually have to remember what the experience was in the first place that made you adapt your behaviour. Otherwise you'll never change things. So it's a bit like the idea of flies don't ever learn. You know, a wasp will keep flying into a window. It doesn't go, oh, I just smacked myself on a window, don't do that again, and adapt its behaviour. It will just keep doing the same thing because it's driven by those very basic responses, those tacit responses. So learned behaviour, you've got to be able to memorise an experience and then adapt your behaviour because of it. Okay, so let's say it can be a brand new behaviour or it could be a modification. So the example they've given you in your notes is the idea that we all have a reflex, which means that when you touch something that is too hot, you've got receptors, thermoreceptors that are able to detect that, sensory neuron, relay neuron, motor neuron to the muscles of your arm, pull your hand away, protect yourself. That is a protective mechanism. You learn through experience what things are probably hot, not necessarily each time by touching them. So if you as a youngster touch something that is incredibly hot, you may learn that that thing, that object, is something that you shouldn't touch. So I'll give you a little example here, a little personal story. When I was very young, my grandparents had a big Aga, because it was a farm kitchen, and it had big hot plates on it, and they're always on, they're always hot. I'm going to make my dad sound like he's an awful parent. He's fantastic. But when I was little, I used to ask him over and over and over again, you know, what will happen if I touch that? What happens if I touch that? Can I touch that? The hot plates. And in the end, I think he was particularly harassed on this day and maybe slightly fed up with me. He said, well, do you know what? Just touch it. Go for it. Just touch it. And I did. And it was incredibly painful. I managed to put my hand onto it, blistered the whole thing. And from then on in, I learnt that Agas are hot and don't touch them. And it's things like that. It's not just simply you touch a hot thing and you take your hand back. It's starting to develop the awareness and the memories of what things are hot. It might be that, you know, you have one of those experiences on a really hot sunny day where if you've ever sat on anything made of sort of metal Again, personal experience. When we were little, we had a holiday in Spain, and they had those, and you won't remember the Chuckle Brothers, but they're those pedal cars where you all sit in the cars and you pedal, and they're awful. But the metal frame of it had got so hot in the sun that when you touched it, it basically burnt your skin. And again, these are the sort of little experiences you have where you're like, oh, something that's made of metal, something that's dark, might be quite hot in the sun, so you're cautious of it. So these are all examples of really simple learned behaviours that just take your initial behaviour, which is to pull away or retract from something that is hot and dangerous, and just take it on a level so that you're using your experience and your memory. And you can also predict things as well. You might come across a new object and be able to think, well, what's it made of? Where is it? What's the weather doing? Should I touch that? And it's things like that. So there's a lot of learning involved. Now, the specific types of learning that we need to cover in this topic are imprinting, which is to do with young organisms being able to sort of latch onto a parent, and that benefits their survival because they learn things, and they also are close to a primary caregiver, which keeps them alive as well. You've got habituation, which is kind of a way of stopping you from becoming desensitized to things. So it sifts kind of between, well, it helps you to become desensitized, to be perfectly frank. It sifts between important stimuli that you need to respond to and continuously respond to, and then the kind of stimuli that you need to sort of switch off and not be constantly bothered about. So, not being constantly aware of the sensation of the chair on your backside. That is a stimulus, but you don't need to be worrying about it or thinking about it. You'll think about it now, but most of the time you're not bothering with it. And anyone who did A-level psychology will know all about the sensory memory, and the idea that all this sensory information is flooding into you constantly, but the majority of it you just need to let go and forget about. And that fits in with this. You need to have habituation to stop you from responding all the time to things that have no positive, so no benefit to your survival, and have no detriments and no negatives. They're just nothingness, if that makes sense. So habituation allows you to ignore essentially anything that is neutral. So any stimuli that is not going to help you or hinder you in any way. Okay, so we've got imprinting and habituation, which I've kind of just been through habituation, and then we got on to conditioning, which is it's a natural part of learning. There are loads of examples of where you get natural organic conditioning happening, where you experience something, you do something, you carry out an action, something bad happens, you learn not to repeat that action because it's bad for you. You're out in the wild and you eat the purple berry and it makes you violently ill, so you don't eat the purple berry anymore. So there's all those sorts of things where you associate a particular action with a particular response. So doing something good happens. I eat food, I feel great. Hey, keep eating food so that you don't starve and die. I eat something stupid and it makes me sick, don't do it again. So those are sort of like organic ones. And then as a society and as individuals, we also use that further. So, we just with each other, with parents, teachers, schools, we all try and reinforce good behaviour, and that is context dependent when we're in society. So whatever we think is a beneficial good behaviour, we will reward it, and that could be that we reward it on a personal level. So we say things like, well done, good going, pat on the back, or when you're little you might get a little reward, a gold star or a present. If you do well at work, you might get some more money, probably not if you work in education. But on the flip side of that, if you do something that is a negative behaviour, you get punished for it. You get told off, you get shouted at, you get sent to your room, you get a black spot on the chart. But we naturally do that anyway with each other because we know the importance of it. And animals do it with each other as well. You often see examples where if a cub does something that is dangerous or stupid, its parent will swat it, will give it a bit of a bop to make sure that it doesn't do it again. So these are all fairly natural things that we are doing all the time, that happen to us all the time. So that's conditioning. We'll talk more about the different types of conditioning. There is classical conditioning and then operant conditioning, which is the idea of trial and error. We've also got things like continuous reinforcement, which is to do with every single time, especially when you're talking about sort of training purposes. Every time something does something beneficial, it is rewarded for it. So it's constantly having it reinforced. Or to the converse, every time it does something bad, it is constantly sort of sanctioned for it. Then you've got the final three, which are exploratory learning. So the kind of learning that you do when you've been spending an awful lot of time with parents. So, you know, you've been taken care of and you've been given chance to sort of go out and have a go at things and see how they work. It's called latent learning because latent kind of means hidden, so it's not always the most obvious type of learning. You've got insight learning, which is all about higher processing ability. We are very good as humans at insight learning, so we are able to connect in or make links with our memory and experiences in the past and then use that to sort of predict future experiences. And I don't mean as in like we're clairvoyance. What I mean is it's the idea of being able to apply your knowledge to a new situation. So a bit like what I was saying earlier about you've had all these experiences where you know that this gets really hot or this is quite painful, and then you come across something that's totally new. Are you able to use your previous experiences to kind of guess whether that's going to be something that's going to hurt you or not, or how it's going to respond, etc. So that's insight learning. And then just the final little bit is about extended parental care. Extended parental care basically gives you more opportunity for learning, because rather than being out there caring for yourself and having to focus on basic survival, somebody else is caring for you. That gives you opportunity and a safety net for you to experience things, have bad things happen, hopefully not too bad, have positive things happen and learn more. And as humans, we keep extending parental care longer and longer, and people get a bit moany about it and talk about snowflakes and all the rest of it. But it is something that we have naturally been doing as humans for quite a long time, and it supposedly allows us to have more time to learn and develop and become better because we have better responses to things. So those are overall the different sections to it. So I'll try and delve backwards and start at the very beginning with imprinting. So imprinting, this is one of these lovely ones, and as I say, when I was talking to Z3 about it, we talked about really good 90s film called Fly Away Home. So famously, it's things like birds that do imprinting. The first thing that they see when they have hatched, the first sort of large object, and hopefully that is a parent for them, it usually is, they will imprint upon. So what that means is they sort of latch onto it and follow it almost obsessively. And that's really good, because if you are a mother hen or a mother duck, you want your brood, your many chicks, to be autonomous in wanting to be with you. So like, they keep themselves with you. You don't have to chase them around and be like, stay with me, guys, otherwise you die. They naturally do that because they have imprinted upon you. And imprinting also means that they're observing you very closely, which means they are learning from you very closely. So a lot of behaviours that might not be innate to those offspring are very rapidly learnt from them imprinting onto a parent, which, as I say, it should be a parent. It's supposed to be the same species. It does happen where organisms imprint on another species. So like in Fly Away Home, you've got all these baby little goslings, little geese, and they imprint on a little girl, but it's okay because she takes care of them. But they learn to follow her about, and she has to think about how she's going to train them to do the things that they're supposed to do. If during lockdown you decide, you know what, I've got a couple of hours to spare, try and see if you can find Fly Away Home on Netflix or a streaming site, just for a bit of a giggle. You can argue that it's educational, either or. So the scientist that did this, and you can find lots and lots of videos with him, is Lorenz. So there's all sorts of old black and white YouTube videos where he's investigating, and he does it all with birds, so it's geese and ducks. And it's all about survival. As I say, all of this at its core comes back to survival of the individual or survival of the species. Habituation, as we say, this is just a way of sifting through stimuli that are beneficial, stimuli that are detrimental, so good, bad, and then sifting out the neutral ones, the ones that you really don't need to be worrying about, you don't need to be responding to, because it's a waste of your energy, it's a waste of resources, and biology is all about trying to maximise our resources and not be inefficient. You don't want to waste energy, even at its core, like ATP, on a response to something that you don't need to worry about. Like, it's not going to benefit you in any way, shape or form. So conditioning, it's basically just sifted into rewards and punishments. And as I say, it doesn't have to be dished out by another individual or a member of your family or a member of an organism's sort of community. It can be within itself, as I say, like eating something that's vaguely poisonous. That's a punishment because you get ill, so you don't do it again. Or doing something that's really beneficial to survival, feels good, so you do it more. And this is why people often joke, don't they, that all the best things in life are all the things that in the end can probably scupper you. So, there's a reason why we like eating food. A lot of us really enjoy food, because at the end of the day, if we didn't enjoy food, we wouldn't last very long. The problem for us all is that we have food, apart from when there are hoarders around, in surplus, so we don't need to eat that much food. We're also programmed to find fatty foods and sugary foods that are highly calorific, particularly tasty. Because obviously, if you think about it, if you are in a sort of life or death scenario and you're trying to work out what's the best food that you can eat and there's limited food, you need the stuff that's got loads of calories, the stuff that's going to give you plenty of energy. So there is an absolute biological reason why we love sugary, fatty things. Other things that help us survival, we really enjoy romance. Humans enjoy sex. There's a reason for it. It needs to happen, otherwise the species stops. So these are all tied in with it. In terms of classical conditioning, so the reflex, the name that everybody goes to straight away is always Pavlov, who was the scientist that did an awful lot of research into conditioning and famously used dogs, looked at their salivation response. So when dogs are about to eat, and this happens with all of us, our olfactory system, our eyesight, when we see and smell food, our digestive system kicks into action, because it's like the stimulus is the food, the response is get ready to digest that food. So something that we do to a lesser degree, but dogs do quite significantly, is salivate. So they produce extra saliva so that they are ready to make a soft bolus so they can swallow it, and also have extra saliva in terms of enzymes. So Pavlov identified this response, and obviously it's good to salivate before you eat food, because otherwise it's quite hard to swallow the food and it doesn't digest as well, so that is a positive response. But he then took it further, so he started investigating into it further. So the natural salivation reflex, that is innate, that's part of what dogs do. Pavlov then started trying to associate a new stimulus into that. So what he did was he associated, through repetition, the food with the sound of a bell. So you had like two stimuli. So the food was there and there was a bell, and the dog salivated. And it wasn't salivating because of the bell to begin with, it's just that the bell was there. Every time the food was there, the bell was there. And then it got to a point where the dogs had learned through conditioning that food and bell happened at the same time. So if food was present, the bell was ringing. So therefore, if the bell was ringing, then the food was present. So by doing that, it modified the response. This is why it's learned. And it got to the point where when they unpaired the stimuli, so when they separated the bell and the food and just rang the bell, the dog still salivated, because it had modified its behaviour. So that is an example of a conditioned reflex, so one that has been modified through conditioning. So that's Pavlov's dogs. Operant conditioning is the trial and error one. So this is where you encourage individuals to carry out sort of natural trialing behaviour. So what happens is normal things that they do, like animals bopping things or pressing things or pecking things, you decide to either reward it or punish it. And in doing that, you will obviously encourage anything that you reward, you encourage, and anything that you punish, you discourage. So what you can do is you can increase the likelihood of an individual repeating certain behaviours or stopping certain behaviours. So it's very much training. It's there to encourage one behaviour and discourage another behaviour. So in a scientific example, there's all sorts of reasons why they do this sort of stuff in terms of psychological research. But if you think about it in terms of, like when we have pets and we're training them, you know, if your puppy goes for a wee outside, you make a big fuss and you say, oh, well done, that's brilliant, congratulations. That it's naturally done that. That was something it chose to do, but you reinforce it. You say, that's really good, do that again. And if it does something negative, so if it wheezes all over your favourite mat, you don't reward it. A lot of people would punish the puppy. We get into the whole morals and ethics behind things like that, though, which is a whole different ball game. In terms of operant conditioning, what you should do is punish them. You should sanction them. It doesn't mean you have to like harm them, but you might, you know, pop them back in like a crate or ignore them. But obviously, in terms of animal welfare, people have said, yeah, don't do things like that. Just reward them when they do something that's really good. So that's the idea of operant conditioning. It relies quite heavily on things like continuous reinforcement. So every time that good thing happens, you reward it. The flip side to continuous reinforcement is intermittent reinforcement. So rather than every time it exhibits a good behaviour, or one that you think is appropriate, you reward it. Instead, you do it infrequently. So it could be you do it at random, or as long as you don't do it every time, or it could be that you do it every third time or every second time or every fifth time. So there's been lots of investigation done into that and whether or not it speeds up learning or speeds up the conditioning. The idea is that continuous reinforcement is supposed to be faster. If you reward them every time or if you punish them every time, they learn very quickly. And the intermittent is slower. However, there is some evidence to the contrary out there. So it might be that there are situations where actually intermittent is more beneficial. You don't need to worry about that at this point, but I can think of there are things like the Skinner box experiment, etc. that are a bit different to it. So exploratory or latent learning. So we're on to page 11 now. This is the last bit of looking at the innate behaviour and the learned behaviour. So this is the idea that you need to be able to sort of remember things that have happened. So experience things by going out and exploring, hence the name, and then remember what's happened and use that to inform sort of future behaviours, etc. So it says animals that spend a long time with their parents have many opportunities for this type of learning. Okay, so it could be like learning the layout of a territory or learning how to escape from predators. The idea is that it's quite a long-lasting one because you've had many opportunities, and it links directly in with extended parental care because you've had this sort of safe space to learn for an extended period. It should mean that your survival rates are far better, if that makes sense. It stays with you and you have learnt it really thoroughly and you live for longer once you are no longer being sort of cared for and learning, etc. So as I say, that links directly into a long period with primary caregivers, a long period where rather than putting all your resources and your efforts into just staying alive and eating and hunting or finding mates and all the rest of it, you are learning instead in a safe space. And then insight learning is the one where we have to use our memories, we have to be able to use application and foresight, and also use things like reasoning, which comes into, again, sort of higher thinking abilities. So you don't tend to get anything like this with any kind of really simple organisms that have simple nervous systems. So insight learning is being able to, like when you see things like certain birds seem to be very good at applying themselves to new situations or coming up with tools, etc. So ravens are very good at it, and certain types of sort of crows are very good at this type of learning, where they are given a unfamiliar context and they are still able to use prior experiences to sort of adapt to it very quickly and apply previous experiences to it in order to survive. So it could be that, you know, they get given things like a piece of metal and they can bend it into a tool and then fish food out of a tube that's been left in the container with them, etc. So those are the main forms of behaviour that we've got. We've got the innate, which we went through in the previous video, and then we've got the learned behaviour, which I hope I've managed to waffle my way through adequately and it's made sense. Again, any questions that you have, just get in touch, let me know. Do have a little look on YouTube and on the internet for sort of further elaboration of these ideas, and I will try and get another video uploaded of me wittering about the next section, which is all about altruistic behaviour, and then moving on to things like courtship.